The Grin. Next door, my nightmare with the smiling man. There's something wrong with my neighbor. I didn't realize it at first. He seemed normal enough when he moved in last winter. Quiet, kept to himself. The only thing that ever struck me as odd was his smile. He smiled too much, an unsettling, plastered grin, as if someone had frozen his face in that expression. But who was I to judge? People have their quirks. It wasn't until the night I heard the screams that I started to understand. It was a bitterly cold January night. I was lying in bed when a blood-curdling scream pierced through the thin walls. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. It sounded like a woman, and it was coming from next door, the smiling man's apartment. The scream was followed by a thud, then silence. I didn't know what to do. Call the police? I waited, straining to hear any more sounds. Nothing. I wanted to believe it was a nightmare, that I had imagined it. But deep down, I knew something terrible had happened. The next morning, I saw him, the smiling man standing in the hallway, holding a garbage bag. He was grinning as always, but this time his eyes were different. Darker, hollow. He caught me looking and waved. "Morning," he said in that unnervingly cheerful tone. "Hope I didn't wake you last night." I forced a smile and shook my head, but I couldn't stop staring at the garbage bag in his hand. It looked heavy, like something large was inside, dragging against the floor. His eyes followed mine. "Cleaning up a mess," he said, still smiling, his voice low, almost a whisper. Then he turned and walked away. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, but I didn't know what to do. People disappear all the time in this city. I told myself that maybe I was overreacting. Maybe the scream was just a TV show. Maybe the bag was just trash. But the next night, it happened again. This time, I was ready. I stayed up, listening. Around 2 a.m., I heard a muffled cry followed by a deep, wet, gurgling sound. I crept to the wall, pressing my ear against it. There was a scuffling noise, like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. Then, silence. My mind raced. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. I grabbed my phone and texted my friend, telling her I was going to check out the neighbor's apartment, just in case. I walked out into the hallway. The door to his apartment was slightly ajar. I stood there, heart pounding, debating if I should knock. Before I could decide, the door creaked open further. My stomach churned as I peered inside. The place was immaculate, clean to the point of being sterile. Except for one thing. In the center of the living room, there was a tarp, stained with something dark. And on top of it, laying lifeless, was a woman. Her body was twisted unnaturally, and her eyes were wide open, frozen in terror. I stumbled back, my throat tightening. That's when I heard the voice behind me. "Don't you just love a clean apartment?" I spun around, and there he was, the smiling man, standing in the doorway, blocking my escape. His grin stretched wider than ever, his teeth gleaming under the dim light. But it wasn't just a smile anymore. It was predatory, like he was savoring my fear. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice still calm, as if we were discussing the weather. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. He took a step closer, his eyes glinting with something dark, something monstrous. "I don't like leaving a mess," he whispered, pulling out a knife from behind his back. The blade shimmered under the light, and I realized in that moment that I wasn't going to leave this place alive. I turned and ran, crashing through the door and sprinting down the hall. Behind me, I could hear his footsteps, slow and deliberate. He wasn't running. He didn't need to. He knew he had time. I reached my apartment, slammed the door, and locked it, my chest heaving. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening. Silence. Then, that voice. "I'll clean up later," he whispered through the crack in the door. "Don't worry, I'm very thorough." I backed away, my heart racing, as I heard his slow footsteps retreating. He wasn't in a hurry. He knew he had all the time in the world. That was a week ago. I've barely slept since then. I called the police, but when they came to check, the smiling man's apartment was spotless. No tarp, no body, no sign of anything wrong. They looked at me like I was crazy. I tried to tell them, to make them believe me, but it was no use. Now every night I hear him. He paces in his apartment, just on the other side of the wall. Sometimes he stops, and I swear I can hear him breathing right next to me. He's waiting, waiting for me to make a mistake, waiting for the perfect time to strike. And every time I close my eyes, I see that smile.